to me. I'm listening.
Hi, thanks for joining us today at JCI Live Austin, where we have some great videos, new news that is current. But I want to start today with the Heart of Texas Banquet that was last Thursday, that my son and daughter, Jonathan and Jamie Gandy, went with us. Kirk Walden was our speaker, and many of you may know that it is through filming here at Austin Public Access that I found my connections to become part of this wonderful Pregnancy Resource Center. Once was called Chacon Pregnancy Resource Center, and now it's called Heart of Texas Pregnancy Resource Center, still here in East Austin, and also we have a location at Dripping Springs. But just in the last 4 years, we began September 2012, there have been over 4,343 visits at the center, 770 pregnancy tests, 2,708 prayer requests, 55,264 diapers, and 3,376 formula and baby food, and baby clothes, 27,174. Just amazing what has gone on in this wonderful Pregnancy Resource Center. I wanted to just say one quote here that Kirk Walden had said in his book, The Wall, that was written in 2013. He says that since before Roe versus Wade, a couple of hundred pregnancy resource centers came on the scene in the late 70s, and in the 80s and 90s, the number boomed to nearly 2,000. Today, you might be surprised at what these 2,500 pregnancy resource centers are accomplishing behind the scenes. From time to time, you may hear of your local pregnancy help centers through your church. You might contribute financially to its work, and you might even volunteer in some capacity. Even if you are familiar with pregnancy resource centers, you may not yet realize that these centers can be the key to ending America's culture of abortion and turning our society back towards life once again. In other news, Senator Ted Cruz was given the Spirit of Enterprise awarded by the United States Chamber Award, the Chamber of Commerce, I believe. I think there's a video picture there. And President Trump signed the NASA, National Air Bill, with Senator Cruz. It's the first NASA bill since 7 years. Senator Ted Cruz spoke to Commercial Space, A New Frontier. He talks about the movie Hidden Figures, and that's the first video we're going to watch.
So thank you for the hospitality. It is great to be with you guys. It is great to be with pioneers, because that's what everyone in this room is doing. Commercial space is a new frontier. Space, as we famously know, is the final frontier, but commercial space, using commercial capital to access space, to explore space, to leverage our abilities, that is an even newer frontier. And it is one where the men and women in this room are at the bleeding edge. So I thank you for your vision and your commitment to the country. You know, I'm reminded a few months ago I went to see the movie Hidden Figures. I suspect many, if not most of you, have probably seen the movie. If you haven't, go see the movie. It's a wonderful, wonderful movie. But I brought both my daughters. My daughters are 6 and 8. And it is the terrific story of 3 African-American female mathematicians at NASA in the 1960s, and their path-breaking work that helped John Glenn orbit the Earth. And it was very interesting for several reasons. One, bringing your girls to it. It was actually the first non-animated movie they'd seen. So everything else was cartoons. This was actual real actors. And they'd never seen segregation. And in the movie, the facilities there are segregated. And in fact, one of the mathematicians is gone for a half hour every day, and her boss yells one day, "Where do you go for a half hour every afternoon?" And the only restroom she was allowed to use was a colored restroom a half mile away. And she was pulling off her shoes and running a half mile to go use the restroom and come back. And there's a great scene in the movie where her boss pulls out a sledgehammer and knocks down the sign that says colored restrooms, says they're all integrated now. And so it was after the movie, I probably spent 30, 40 minutes with my girls. They're saying, why would anyone do that? I don't understand. And it was a good discussion about our nation's troubled history in that regard. But another aspect that was particularly meaningful is that in addition to bringing both my girls, I brought my mom. Now, my mom is 82, and she graduated from Rice in 1956.
Go Rice. 98 though.
Well, when she went, it was the Rice Institute. And she became a computer programmer. And one of the very first projects she did was working for the Smithsonian, helping calculate the orbits of Sputnik. Now, the movie Hidden Figures begins with them helping calculate the orbits of Sputnik. So I had to ask my mom, I'm like, all right, Mom, how realistic was that? What did you think of the movie? And she thought it was very accurate about what it was like to be a female mathematician in the 1950s and 1960s. She thought it captured it quite accurately. And I made a comment. I said, one of the odd things I thought about the movie to the more modern ear was that the programmers, the mathematicians, were called computers. We think of computers as a hunk of metal on our desk. And, they had a sign, Colored Computers was their office with all of the mathematicians. And my mom starts laughing. She says her very first job was at Shell in 1956, and she said, my first title was computer. That's what they called me. And so it was a nice chance to talk also to my girls about their grandmother and how trailblazers, whether in the 1950s and 60s or trailblazers today, can accomplish just about anything. And we've got a lot to accomplish. For space, yesterday was an important day. Our office began about a year ago trying to work to bring together a coalition to pass a NASA reauthorization bill. As you know, there hadn't been a NASA authorization bill for 7 years, since 2010. And we started working about a year ago because, obviously, there was presidential election coming up. There was a transition coming up. And, in the past, transitions have not been kind to NASA. Whether Republican or Democrat, when we started, we had no idea who was going to win. I promise you we did not start the bill anticipating Donald Trump would be president. I can say that with complete confidence. But we knew somebody new would be president. And in the past, when you've had transitions, Republicans or Democrats, we've seen whole new agendas emanating from the White House that result in chaos and uncertainty at NASA and space exploration. You see programs canceled, like the Constellation program canceled, which cost thousands of jobs and wasted billions of dollars. And we didn't want to see that happen. Whoever won the election, we didn't want to see that happen. So the objective of this bill, more than anything else, was to provide continuity and stability and a firm foundation for NASA to continue. And so we worked hard to bring together, first in the Senate, worked with Bill Nelson, the ranking member who cares deeply about this issue. Bill and I worked very, very closely on this legislation together, to then start to go through each of the different equities on the Senate side. There are a few senators that care about space. For some reason, the Alabama folks I'm not sure why, but they've got kind of an interest in this. And as you know, there are partisan rocks to be navigated. There are ideological rocks to be navigated. There are geographical rocks to be navigated. There are parochial rocks to be navigated. They're just personality rocks to be navigated. And then you've got the House of Representatives with yet a few more challenges. So at the end of last year, we spent a lot of time negotiating the deal, coming out of the election, negotiating the deal. We had everything cleared and lined up in the Senate. And we went and reached out to our counterparts in the House. We reached out to Lamar Smith and Brian Babbitt and John Culberson and said, look, we're not going to have time, just looking at the calendar, we're not going to have time for us to pass a bill, you to pass a bill, us to go to conference. That ain't going to happen. The only way we get this done is if we pre-conference it. If we sit down on the front end and our office understands what you care about and we reflect those priorities in the bill to begin with. And so we spent months sitting down with our House counterparts, listening to their priorities, trying to reflect them in the bill. And we had green lights on everything. Everything, all systems go. And then, at the end of last year, my friend Joe Manchin decided to shut down the Senate for the last 3 days. You'll recall he was having a dispute over coal miners, and so he froze everything in the Senate. And a senator can do that, and Joe did that. The consequence of that was that our bill couldn't pass the Senate. And if it couldn't pass the Senate, we couldn't send it to the House. Now, finally, after 3 or 4 days, Joe relented. We got our bill up, and it passed the Senate. And the problem was the House had already adjourned. So by the time we were able to get it through, the House was gone. Now, that could have been the end of it in the prior Congress, but one of the things that Bill and I both wanted to do when we came back, we said, all right, we got a new Congress, we got a new president, let's pass this anyway. We've got enough buy-in, let's pass it anyway. And so we brought it up, passed it through the Senate again. By the way, everyone who had green-lighted it, at least half of them had new issues with it. This is Congress. It's like, wait a second, a month ago you gave it, you signed off on it. Well, people said, what? One more thing. You know, it's sort of like Columbo. Any of you ever watched the old show Columbo? You know, when he's at the door in his rumpled coat, it turns out, one more thing. There's a lot of that in Congress. And then in the House, we had it in the House. It hits a few more rocks in the House. But at the end of the day, all of those got navigated. And yesterday, as you know, we had a bill signing where the president signed it. That was an important victory. It was an important victory for the men and women here. Many of you here worked closely with our office in drafting that bill. In drafting that bill to provide the stability, the continuity, to provide a clear bipartisan support for American leadership in space. Not just passive, not following from behind, but leadership. Clear and aggressive bipartisan support for the mission to Mars. A big, bold, beautiful vision, as the president might say. Clear bipartisan support, actually building on 2 years earlier. As you know, I also authored the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act, which also passed and was signed into law by Obama, which was designed to help preserve and strengthen your industry, to help keep in place the regulatory pause so that you don't have folks from this town descending upon you like locusts, making it harder and harder to explore and innovate in space. Extending the life of the International Space Station to 2024, and then in the NASA reauthorization, instructing NASA to study extending it even 4 more years to 2028. So the $100 billion plus we've invested in that, we get the maximum return possible off of that. Demonstrating a strong bipartisan commitment to commercial space, commercial crew, commercial cargo. All of that was reflected in the bill. Now, there were some folks, by the way, particularly some of my friends in the House, who wanted to be even more aggressive. Let's go big, let's go bold. And I'll tell you, my view is, look, let's start with a firm and steady foundation. You can swing for the fences next time. Let's start with stability. because stability is critical for long-term planning. If you don't know what's happening in 6 months or a year, it's impossible to have sensible long-term planning. So I commend an awful lot of people who worked very, very hard in both the Senate, both the House, to get this passed. I commend each of you for your input. And now in a new year, now we have the chance to think bigger and bolder. In this coming Congress, I hope to take up another commercial space launch piece of legislation and a longer-term NASA authorization bill. This is designed to be a transitional authorization as we get a new administration in place. We're going to have, hopefully soon, a new NASA administrator. When that happens, I look forward to working closely with the administration to laying out a long-term authorization for NASA, long-term goals, long-term structures. And that is an area on both of those, the new commercial space legislation and the new NASA authorization, both of those will continue to need and want your input, your guidance, your wisdom and expertise. From my perspective, I want to see the commercial space sector flourishing with robust competition, with innovation, and with NASA as an active and invested partner. And I think the potentials are endless. And with that, why don't I open it up to a few questions?
Hi. So this last week, the Senate held hearings to confirm Judge Neil Gorsuch as a Supreme Court judge. I believe the questions and exchange between Senator Ted Cruz and Judge Neil Gorsuch will help you know him better personally as a person of integrity and honor. I'm going to start with the most recent speech that Senator Ted Cruz gave, I believe it was on Thursday, criticizing the hypocrisy of the Democrats criticizing a sitting judge. And then I will show a video from the first day of Judge Neil Gorsuch confirmation with Senator Ted Cruz, and then the second day was Senator Ted Cruz on Judge Gorsuch. It's a longer video of the two attorneys, and it shows a great interaction that really shows the background stories of not only integrity, but also humor.
We've heard over the past several days a number of my Democratic colleagues in Congress bemoan and condemn, quote, vicious and reckless and personal attacks against judges. What they have called a, quote, unprecedented attack against the credibility and independence of the judiciary. And so if I understand their argument correctly, it is completely inappropriate. It is an absolute abuse of power to criticize, to malign, to attack judges. Now, if that's their argument, Mr. Gorsuch, I've got a question for you. What position do you currently hold?
I'm a judge on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals.
And if the Senate were not to confirm you to the Supreme Court, what position would you continue to hold then?
One I happily enjoy now.
So if you are and will continue to be a federal judge on the Court of Appeals, it's interesting to assess how my Democratic colleagues have fared under their own test, that it is inappropriate, that it is offensive to somehow malign a federal judge. Former Speaker Nancy Pelosi said on national television, Judge Gorsuch is, quote, hostile to women's rights and holds radical views far outside the mainstream of American legal thought. She continued, quote, what saddens me the most as a mom and a grandmother is his hostility towards children in school, children with autism. She additionally went on to say, quote, if you breathe air, drink water, eat food, take medicine, or in any other way interact with the courts, if you care about that for your children, He's not your guy. It's interesting, given the Democrats are complaining about people criticizing federal judges. Senator Whitehouse on Monday said, quote, "Tellingly, big special interests and their front groups are spending millions of dollars in a dark money campaign to push your confirmation. They obviously think you will be worth their money." That also somehow falls short of the Democrats' complaints about criticisms directed at the judiciary. Indeed, Senator Hirono on Monday said, quote, "You consistently choose corporations and powerful interests over people. Ideology over common sense, and indeed the purpose of the law." Senator Durbin, "In case after case, you either dismissed or rejected efforts by workers and families to recognize their rights and defend their freedoms." Senator Franken, "But if the past is prologue, then I fear that confirming you would guarantee more of the same from the Roberts courts. Decisions that continue to favor powerful corporate interest over the rights of average Americans." Tom Perez, the DNC chairman, "Gorsuch on the Supreme Court is intolerable. Judge Gorsuch would discriminate against a majority of Americans from the bench." The chairman of the Democratic Party charging that a judge would discriminate. These are serious attacks. Many of them impugn your integrity directly. And yet, this is a confirmation hearing. The founders understood a confirmation hearing would be in the political arena. My colleagues, the Democrats, have a right to engage in whatever attacks they choose. But it's a little rich for them to be maligning a sitting federal judge and at the same time giving speeches about how unacceptable it is for anyone to criticize a federal judge. You can't have both at the same time. Now, I'm not going to ask you to respond to any of these attacks. I actually think these attacks speak for themselves. But I will ask you this. As a judge today, and as I believe a justice in short order, will you pledge to be faithful to the law and the Constitution and neither favor nor disfavor any litigant based on who they are?
I guarantee you no more, and I promise you no less.
That is precisely what we should expect of judges.
I wanted to show this video first because watching the Senate hearings this week, and actually in the last year, it makes me realize how the Senate Democrats are unrealistic of biblical wisdom. So the second video I'm going to show from this Senate hearing is the first day of Judge Neil Gorsuch confirmation and Senator Ted Cruz. And then right after that, Jonathan will go into the second day where Senator Ted Cruz talks to Judge Gorsuch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Judge Gorsuch, welcome. Thank you for your decades of service, honorable service. Thank you for your family being here today. And thank you for your willingness to endure the spectacle of this confirmation hearing. February 13th of last year was a devastating day for those of us who revere the Constitution and the rule of law. On that day, we lost Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. Justice Scalia was one of the greatest justices to ever sit on the court. He was a trailblazing advocate for the original meaning of the Constitution and a shining example of judicial humility. His death left an enormous hole not only in our hearts, but in the protections for the rule of law. And it left enormous shoes to fill. A daunting task that I know weighs on you as you consider the enormity of what is in front of you. Today, there is a sharp disagreement about the very nature of the Supreme Court.
Some people view the court as a hyper-powerful political branch. When they grow frustrated with the legislative process and the will of the people, they turn to the courts to try to see their preferred policies enacted. For conservatives, we understand the opposite is true. We read the Constitution and see that it imbues the federal judiciary with a much more modest role than the left embraces. Judges are not supposed to make law, they are supposed to faithfully apply it. Justice Scalia was a champion of this modest view of the judicial role. But had his vacant seat been filled by Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton, Justice Scalia's legacy would have been in grave danger. If they had filled his seat, we would have seen a Supreme Court where the will of the people would have been repeatedly cast aside by a new activist Supreme Court majority. We would have seen a Supreme Court majority that viewed itself as philosopher kings who had the power to decide for the rest of us what policy should govern our nation and control every facet of our lives. We would have seen our democratic process controlled by 5 unelected lawyers here in Washington, D.C. That would have been a profound and troubling shift in the direction of the Supreme Court and in our nation's future. That is why, after Justice Scalia's untimely death, the Senate chose to exercise our explicit constitutional authority, and we advised President Obama that we would not consent to a Supreme Court nominee until the people, in the midst of a presidential election, were able to choose. For 80 years, the Senate had not filled a Supreme Court vacancy that had occurred in a presidential election year, and the Senate majority rightly decided that last year would not become the first in 8 decades. The people, therefore, had a choice between an originalist view of the Constitution represented by Justice Scalia or a progressive and activist view of the Constitution represented by Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. During the campaign, President Trump repeatedly promised to nominate justices in the mold of Justice Scalia. And indeed, he laid out a specific list of 21 judges, constitutionalists from whom he said he would choose his nominee. Judge Gorsuch was one of those 21. Issuing such a list was a move without precedent in our country's presidential history. And it created the most transparent process for selecting a Supreme Court justice that our nation has ever seen. The voters had a direct choice. The voters understood the 21 men and women from whom the president would pick. And they had a very different vision of a Supreme Court justice that was put forth by Hillary Clinton. And in November, the people spoke. In what was essentially a referendum on the kind of justice that should replace Justice Scalia, the people chose originalism, textualism, and rule of law. The people chose judicial humility. The people chose protecting the Bill of Rights, our free speech, our religious liberty, our Second Amendment, rather than handing policy-making authority over to judges on the Supreme Court. Given that history, given the engagement of the electorate nationally on this central issue, I would suggest that Judge Gorsuch is no ordinary nominee. Because of this unique and transparent process, unprecedented in the nation's history, his nomination carries with it a super legitimacy that is also unprecedented in our nation's history. The American people played a very direct role in helping choose this nominee. Like the renowned justice he is set to replace, Judge Gorsuch is brilliant and has an impeccable academic record. His judicial record demonstrates a faithful commitment to the Constitution and the rule of law. He has refused to legislate his own policy preferences from the bench, while recognizing the pivotal role the judiciary plays in defending the fundamental liberties protected in the Bill of Rights. On the night he was nominated, Judge Gorsuch channeled Justice Scalia when he explained that, quote, "A judge who likes every outcome he reaches is very likely a bad judge, stretching for results he prefers rather than those the law demands." That is exactly right. And those words should give comfort to the American people and to my Democratic colleagues. And it's worth recalling that our friends on the Democratic side of the aisle understand this, and indeed, not too long ago, agreed with it. A decade ago, Judge Gorsuch was confirmed by this committee for the Federal Court of Appeals by a voice vote. He was likewise confirmed by the entire United States Senate by a voice vote without a single Democrat speaking a word of opposition. Not a word of opposition from Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, not from Harry Reid or Ted Kennedy or John Kerry, not from Senators Feinstein, Leahy, or Durbin, who still sit on this committee, not even from Senators Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, or Joe Biden. Not a one of them spoke a word against Judge Gorsuch's nomination a decade ago. And the question this hearing poses to our Democratic colleagues is, what has changed? What has changed? 10 years ago, Judge Gorsuch was so unobjectionable, he didn't merit even a whisper of disapproval. In the decades since, he has had an objectively exemplary record. By any measure, he has shown himself to be even more worthy of the bipartisan support he received back then. Unfortunately, modern reality suggests that's probably not something my Democratic colleagues feel they can do in today's political environment. Many probably believe they have no choice but to try to manufacture attacks against Judge Gorsuch, whether they want to or not, just to preserve their own political future and protect themselves from primaries back home. We're seeing some of these baseless attacks already. Most recently, some Democrats have tried to slander Judge Gorsuch as being, quote, against the little guy because he has dared to rule based on the law that Congress has passed, and not on the specific identity of the specific litigants appearing before him. This is absurd. For one thing, many of these same critics have spent the last 8 years attacking the Little Sisters of the Poor, a Catholic charity of nuns, for having the audacity to live according to their deeply held religious beliefs. You really need to take a long look in the mirror if one day you find yourself attacking nuns, attacking the Little Sisters of the Poor, and then the next day you find yourself orating on the need to protect the little guy. A judge's job is not to protect the little guy or the big guy. A judge's job, and a judge swears an oath to uphold the Constitution and to follow the law fairly, impartially, and equally for every litigant, little or big. In the past weeks as well, some of my Democratic colleagues have questioned Judge Gorsuch's independence and suggested that he needs to answer questions about the actions and statements and even the tweets of the president who appointed him. I would ask, was Justice Ginsburg or Justice Breyer asked about the sexual harassment suit that had been filed against President Clinton by Paula Jones? No, neither was asked about that suit. Was Justice Kagan asked about President Obama's incendiary comments at the State of the Union attacking the Supreme Court for a decision he disagreed with? No, of course not. Those questions were not asked because they were inappropriate political questions that have nothing to do with the record of the nominee before this committee. Justice Ginsburg, Justice Breyer, Justice Kagan were not asked those questions, and Judge Gorsuch should not be either. Instead, we should evaluate this nomination on the record, on the merits, and on that ground, I have every confidence that Judge Gorsuch will be confirmed as the next Associate Justice of the Supreme Court.
Senator.
Has been helpful for illustrating the proper temperament and approach that we should expect of a federal judge, and I think you are acquitting yourself in an excellent manner. This hearing is focused on a lot of weighty matters. So let me start with something lighter and a topic on which
I believe you have some familiarity. What is the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything?
42.
Thank you, Judge. And for those who are watching who may be a bit confused at this exchange, could you explain what it is to which we're referencing?
Well, Senator, sometimes we have young people who come to court to be sworn in. Often they're my law clerks. There are a couple of them right there. They haven't enjoyed this privilege yet. And they come to court and they're very nervous. And the clerk tells us about their career and their record, and then submits them to the court. I move their admission to the bar. Are there any questions from the bench? And it's sort of like this. It's a bit intimidating. This has been a reminder to me of what it's like to be down here rather than up there. And the last time I had this kind of interaction with Senator Lee, it was when he was down here and I was up there. At any rate, I sometimes ask them that question to put them at ease. And they all know the answer, and they all know the answer because they've all read Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And if you haven't read it, you should. It may be one of my daughter's favorite books, and so that's a family joke.
Well, it is a book I very much enjoyed as well, and it is, I think, a delightful example of the humanity of a judge that your record has demonstrated. You began your career with the opportunity to serve as a law clerk to Byron White. Byron White is an extraordinary man. Byron White was the only justice that John F. Kennedy put on the Supreme Court. Byron White is, I believe, in fact, I'm quite certain, the only Supreme Court justice in history to lead the NFL in rushing. And also to graduate first in his class from Yale Law School. Could you share with this committee what it was like to be a law clerk for Byron White and to interact with him every day during your clerkship?
You know, as I said, he really was my childhood hero. And to actually get picked out of the pile, to spend a year with him, as Senator Lee's dad did, that's something we share in common too, was and remains the privilege of a lifetime. And it has everything to do with why I'm here. I wouldn't have become a judge but for watching his example. And the humility with which he approached the job. And I don't mean a phony humility. I mean real humility. Every day. He always said 2 heads were better than 1. He'd sit down in my office, plunk himself down in a chair across the desk. He'd be talking about a case and say, Always started with a grunt. I mean, that's how he started a conversation. It was like, hello. So what does the great Justice Gorsuch think about this one? And you were expected to have a view about pretty much anything and everything that he asked. And he'd just sit there and chuckle at you. And he'd laugh at you. And you're wondering what he thought. He never revealed his hand. And he'd just walk out of the office saying, oh, that's what Justice Gorsuch thinks. Okay. And then he'd go back and he'd think about it himself. And then he'd come back in again. And the whole thing would repeat itself. As he was working through each case himself, he'd want to bounce ideas off of this know-nothing 20-something-year-old kid. And that, to me, taught me everything about what it means to be a judge. And the fact that when asked his judicial philosophy in this sort of setting, he said it's to decide cases. And I know a lot of people think that's just mundane or maybe cover dishonesty in some way. It's just not true. It was the humility of the man. That he knew that lawyers worked really hard because he had been a lawyer, a workaday lawyer for 14 years, I think it was, in a law firm. He tried cases, small cases, big cases. And he knew what it was like to have to be the lawyer in the well, and how hard it is to have all the answers, how easy it is to ask the questions.
Now, you and I both had the experience of clerking at the Supreme Court after Justice White had ended his time on the basketball court.
Yeah.
Or maybe you were luckier than I. For those who do not know, above the Supreme Court, above the roof of the courtroom, is a basketball court, which is referred to tongue-in-cheek as the highest court in the land. And Justice White, for many years, would play in the basketball games. NFL Hall of Fame football player with a bunch of pencil-neck law clerks.
Yep.
And his elbows and fouls were legendary. When I was clerking, he was no longer playing. Perhaps, were you lucky enough to get him up on the basketball court?
He would come up for a game of horse with the clerks, former law clerks at reunions.
How's his jump shot?
His best shot at that age, we're talking in his 70s, late 70s, was from the free throw line back up over his head like that. And he could hit it pretty regularly. His eye-hand coordination was just uncanny. So I remember those law clerk reunions at the basketball court where he'd come up and stiffly throw it up and sink it. I remember walking through him in the basement, arm in arm. Like to walk arm in arm at that age. And we walked past all the portraits of all the former Supreme Court justices, which are down in the ground level. And he'd ask me, Ron, how many of these guys you honestly recognize? And I was one of those pencil-neck law clerks. And the truth was, I thought I knew a lot about the Supreme Court, the law. And the answer was about half, the honest answer. And he said, me too. He said, the truth is, we'll all be forgotten soon enough, me included. And I remember saying, Justice, that's impossible. You're one of the greats. No way you're going to be forgotten. His portrait now hangs down in the basement.
Well, there is wisdom in that humility. Let's shift to another topic, a topic that has been raised some in this hearing, which is there are some Democratic senators on this committee who have raised a challenge to the notion of originalism, and indeed have painted originalism as some quaint and outdated mode of interpreting the Constitution, have suggested that their view of the Constitution, it is a living, breathing, changing document, flexible enough to accommodate whatever policy outcome the particular judge might desire. The alternative is that a judge is obliged to follow the Constitution, the text of the Constitution, as informed by the original understanding at the time it was adopted. Do you share the view of the Democratic attacks that originalism is somehow a quaint and outdated notion of reading the Constitution for what it says?
Senator, I want to say a few things about that, and I appreciate the opportunity. The first is that sometimes we in our discourse today, our civil discourse, use labels as a way to not engage with other people, to treat and divide us and them. And as a judge, I just don't think that's a very fair or appropriate or useful way to engage in discourse. So I'm worried about using labels in ways that are sometimes an excuse for engagement with the ideas, sometimes pejoratively. The truth is, I don't think there's a judge alive who doesn't want to know about whatever legal text he or she is charged with interpreting, something about its original meaning as enacted. And I don't think this is an ideological thing. I look at decisions like Jones, which we've talked about, or decisions like Kylo, the thermal imaging of a home. Is that a search under the Fourth Amendment? The Supreme Court goes back and looks at the original history and says it's equivalent to peeping toms, which of course would be a search under the Fourth Amendment. The Constitution's no less protective today of the people's liberties than it was 200 years ago. Or when we look at Crawford and the right to confront witnesses and not just have pieces of paper flying in evidence that you can't confront reasonably, to cross-examine your opponent, fundamental right of the Sixth Amendment. Look back to the original understanding. That informs us. Or in the Fifth Amendment, Justice Stevens in Apprendi wrote a very fine examination of the original history of the Constitution and said it's not right that an individual should be sentenced to prison and then a hand sentence on the basis of facts a jury hasn't found. Those are all originalist, if you want to put that label on it, opinions, every one of them. You could look at Powell versus McCormick about the qualifications of members of Congress. That was written by Chief Justice Warren. It's a very careful, we might agree or disagree with it, it's a very careful examination of the original history and understanding of the relevant provisions of the Constitution. Or Heller, Second Amendment case. Justice Scalia and Justice Stevens both, majority and dissent, wrote opinions that are profoundly thoughtful in examining the original history of the Constitution. I guess I'm with so many other people who've come before me, Justice Story, Justice Black, and yes, Justice Kagan, who, sitting at this table, said we're all originalists in this sense. And I believe we are.
Well, Judge, I thank you for that very scholarly and erudite answer. You are right that Justice Kagan gave an answer that had many similar aspects and said, we apply what they say, what they meant to do. So in that sense, we are all originalists. And, you know, you referenced the Kylo case. I think it serves well to rebut the caricature that some on the left try to paint of originalism. They're dealing with thermal imaging. You know, the notion that, gosh, how could the framers possibly imagine modern contrivances, modern contraptions? Well, thermal imaging did not exist in the 1700s. Right. The framers had no idea what it was. And so under the caricature that some of the Democrats have suggested, you would assume the originalists in the case would all line up on the side of saying, well, gosh, the Fourth Amendment doesn't cover that. And yet the Kylo case, the majority opinion, 5-4, was written by Justice Scalia, perhaps the leading originalist on the court. It was joined by Justice Thomas. And indeed, Justice Stevens dissented in that case. And so I think that case illustrates that any judge doing his or her job, a thorough understanding of the original understanding of the language is essential to effectively doing your job. Would you share your thoughts about how the Constitution intersects with modern technology, how a 200-plus-year-old document can possibly be applied in a world of internet and technology and changing reality?
Well, it's just these discussions we've been having, right? You go back and you look to the evidence of what it was understood at the time to protect. Of course, Madison didn't know about thermal imaging or GPS tracking devices or DNA or email. And no one is looking to take us back to the horse and buggy day or quill pens or to turn back the clock on anything. The point is to apply the law in a way that allows us to be able to say as judges, it's not what we wish. It's what the law was understood to mean. It has a fixed meaning, as Madison said, in the fixed meaning canon of construction, that the Constitution should have a fixed meaning. Right? And the judges may disagree over what that is. We disagree once in a while. Not as often as some would like to portray. Once in a while. But our disagreements are not political disagreements. They're disagreements over what the law is. That's very important to me. And the other thing it does is it's a due process value. We're interpreting the law in a way that we can charge people with notice of, because we're judging them for their past conduct. People lose their liberty, their property, on the basis of our interpretations of the law. And it seems to me that it should only be fair that there are interpretations we can charge them with notice of. Right? Similar thing when we come to statutory interpretation. Right? What does that text mean? What could a reasonable reader understand that text to mean? You know, my favorite case in statutory interpretation when I teach this stuff and talk to my law clerks about it is the fish case. You know, that there the statute read something like, and I'm not going to get it exactly right, but if you destroy email, documents, or other tangible objects when you know the cops are after you, you go to jail. Well, what does that mean in the context of a fisherman who knows the Coast Guard's after him and he's got an illegal catch and he throws it overboard? That case went to the United States Supreme Court. It's a great case. And it divided in a way that people don't expect, right? Justice Ginsburg wrote the majority opinion, and along with Justice Alito writing a concurrence, saying, fish, this statute's about email. Nah, no notice. Justice Kagan and Justice Scalia wrote a dissent saying, fish, that's a tangible object, right? He had notice. He shouldn't have done it. And so these things don't divide along any kind of ordinary ideological line. I am confident that there are justices who in that case, or in Heller, or in any of these cases, would, as a matter of policy, have come out differently than they did as a matter of judging. And that, to me, is all the difference in the world. We're not doing what we would like, but what we think the law is.
Let's turn to another topic. Some of my colleagues on the Democratic side have raised some questions about the Federalist Society and have raised it with a tone that suggests it is some nefarious and secret organization. Indeed, I was waiting to see the question, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Federalist Society? And given that context, for the sake of candor, I'll go ahead and self-report now. I am and have been a member of the Federalist Society since I was 21 years old and a first-year law student when I happily joined. And indeed, there are over 60,000 members, law students and lawyers, and indeed those just interested in the Constitution and the rule of law. And one of the things that has struck me about the Federalist Society is the incredible range and diversity of opinions within the Federalist Society. You have conservatives, you have libertarians, you have those who believe in fidelity to law and wouldn't ascribe to either of those labels. And I understand you gave a talk at a Federalist Society event at the problems of overcriminalization. Can you tell us a bit about that talk?
Yeah, I think it's fun to go into audiences and challenge them sometimes a bit. I think it's important. And as to the Federalist Society, I don't have a card either. And I really don't want a back statement for past due dues. But I attend maybe one event a year or something like that. It's all on my forms that you all have. And at that speech, I did talk to the society about the problem of overcriminalization as I saw it. On the federal statutory books today, we have approximately 5,000 criminal laws. That doesn't count, of course, all the criminal laws at the state and local level. And Congress pours out a lot of new criminal laws all the time. Most of those laws are relatively recent vintage. And I asked my law clerks to go find out, okay, now, how many of those, how many laws do we have that have criminal penalties that are in regulations too, right? Just out of curiosity. I thought they'd be able to come back with a number. And apparently, they reported back, and I trust them, they're pretty smart. They came back and said that scholars have given up trying to count the number. They gave up at around 300,000. And Madison warned, he lived in a time when there were too few written laws, so that the king could pretty much do as he or she wished. Tyrannical king. That's the experience they had. But he foresaw a world and warned about a world in which we have too many laws, to the point where the people can't know what the law is. And of course, there's the great example of Caligula, right, who posted laws, ancient Roman emperor, deliberately posted laws written in a hand so small and up so high that nobody could tell what the law was. Better to keep the people on their toes. Sorry. And that's a problem too, right? For due process, fair notice. And the truth is, like so much else in life, we're aiming for the golden mean. Not too much, not too little. Point where people have enough fair notice, but aren't overwhelmed. That's what I spoke about.
Well, and I agree with you. It is a significant problem, one that this committee has addressed multiple times, and I hope will continue to address. Indeed, I'm reminded of one legal thinker who famously observed, "In heaven there is no law, and the lion lies down with the lamb. In hell, there is nothing but law, and due process is meticulously obeyed." And living in a situation where, by the count you just shared, there are over 300,000 potential crimes in a regulatory sense, at some point makes it exceedingly difficult for an honest citizen to conduct himself or herself in a way that doesn't run afoul of the law. And that is something that should concern all of us. I would note, when you gave this speech, would you say it is fair to say that not everyone at the Federalist Society who heard your speech agreed with everything you said?
Oh, goodness. That was the whole point of the speech, Senator.
Well, and in my experience, a great many Federalist Society events are structured as debates, where you have sometimes sharply contrasting views for the purpose of intellectual discussion and hopefully thinking and addressing hard problems.
And there's a counterpart to the Federalist Society now, the American Constitutional Society.
Right.
One of my friends who's just here is on the board, does similar good work.
Sure.
I think these societies, debating societies, useful to ideas percolating, being shared.